Tell me, what are mealtimes like at your house? Is it a constant battle to get food in your children's mouths? Is it a constant battle to feed them healthy food? Do you feel that your child is stuck in a rut of eating only a small selection of food choices? As an adult, do you eat a variety of foods, or are you sensorily predictable about the foods that you eat? The sad thing is that it's not common knowledge for us as parents to know that there can be a huge amount of fear around eating different foods. We do not know or understand the sensory fears that food can bring. Disliking the taste of foods is usually our first go-to, as we know there are so many foods that don't taste great, even for adults. The sensory fear of food also involves how the food looks, feels, smells, and possibly the noises associated with it. For example, the fear of the sound that popcorn makes. Have a think right now about the foods you might find sensorily unacceptable as an adult. My husband has several food dislikes, and one of them is custard slices. Now, a custard slice in Australia has set custard in between two sheets of flaky pastry with icing on top. He hates the texture and the lumpiness of the custard. As an adult, he can choose to eat what he wants, so there are no food battles on this one. My kids, who are now adults, won't eat ice cream on a stick because they hate the thought of their tongue touching the wooden stick underneath the ice cream. There you go. I've never been able to get them to eat ice cream on a stick. Am I concerned? No, I've never been. Ice cream's not a food that's of value to my children's health. Had it been fruit and vegetables, it might have been a different story. There are so many things to investigate before we unnecessarily label our children as fussy or picky eaters. Examining the reasons behind food refusal is the very first place to start. So put down your knife and fork and stop trying to force that healthy broccoli down your children's or husband's throat and ask some questions. I'm Kate Mason, and welcome to Parenting and Personalities. This is the podcast that connects you to the ones you care about the most. Dr Sam Goldman joins us on the show today to talk about food struggles, picky eating, and sensory food issues that might make mealtimes feel like a daily battleground and introduce steps to a calmer eating space. Sam is a business owner, occupational therapist, and a self-confessed sensory nerd, obsessed with providing research-backed education both in her business and with her therapy clients. She has more than 9 years of experience working with families on maximising their child's development, feeding, and sensory processing, both in hospital and outpatient settings. She loves working one-on-one with families, but in her time working in the hospital setting, realised that parents weren't getting the education they needed to feel empowered and confident about introducing new foods to their sensational child. She created @Dr Sam Goldman. Sam's My Food Explorers membership helps busy parents consistently introduce new foods to their children without fighting or tears. Hello, Sam. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, so am I, because we were talking about sleep the other week on an earlier podcast, and sleep and food are some of the things that parents worry about the most with their children. You know, it's often something that we overthink and get stressed about because we want to be great parents and we want to have our children just right and be doing the right thing. So could you just tell me, how did you start the journey that you are on to help people with sensory issues for their children and themselves?
Yep. So I am an occupational therapist and a feeding therapist, which is definitely where I started. And I kind of had a unique opportunity where I worked in the hospital systems, and that's where I learned all about food and feeding therapy. And as an occupational therapist, kind of our bread and butter is sensory. And kind of the really interesting thing is, out of school, everybody thinks OTs come out really prepped in sensory. And the truth was that my experience wasn't like that. And I think a lot of other OTs too. And when I actually did my own research, started really learning about it, getting into it, the outcomes of my clients became a lot better. My understanding was a lot better. And I want to share that with other people because I feel like it's really hard to find. When you are a parent going through something sensory related and you are searching for answers, there's not that much online available for you, and not that much online in really easy to understand terms. And so that's kind of how I verged into what I'm doing now. Is I couldn't find the resources. I was super frustrated that I couldn't find them to provide to my clients and my parents. So I started to make my own.
Excellent. So in that sense, obviously the OT training didn't really cover. I mean, often all medical training seem to miss some areas. And I think sensory stuff has become so much more important these days. I'm 62, so when I was young, that wasn't even looked at, whereas these days it's a far higher searched thing for people to look at and see. So when you trained around the sensory stuff, what kind of things did you look at to get your knowledge around it?
Yeah, so I would say in school, one of the really cool things, but also one of the more challenging things about occupational therapy is that it is a very broad profession. So we cover everything from mental health to physical health to splinting to helping people transition home when they're having a hard time with their daily activities. So when it comes to occupational therapy, for everyone who doesn't know, is our goal is to help people live their lives and participate in their lives, in their daily lives, to their maximum ability. So as you know, that's a pretty broad statement. And so when it comes to training in school, there's only so much they can fit in that time. So I would say training sensory-wise in school, I maybe had 1 or 2 lectures on it, which really wasn't a lot. So when it came to training personally, reading books, I'm big on reading books, finding really great course providers, so other occupational therapists who are leading in this area. So Jean Ayres is she is the sensory person who started this. So making sure to follow her stuff and a lot of the people who have worked with her. So reading and courses, I would say, is the best way to get started learning about it.
That's great. So tell us about your occupation in hospitals and how that influenced what you would do today as well.
Oh my goodness. It is I think what formed me as a true occupational therapist. I never thought I would work in hospitals. I thought it was a little scary for me, honestly.
Yeah.
But I had just
It is scary.
It is scary, but I kind of fell into it in a really great way. I did a rotation in school in the neonatal intensive care unit. And then from there, I started to work in a pediatric hospital. And it just totally opened up my eyes to what families really experience and what they experience at really their toughest moments. And so it gave me a really unique view both on, because I've also worked in the outpatient setting, what things look like at home with families, but also what things look like during those tougher, more critical moments.
So with the families, were you looking at the sensory food issues at the time or overall sensory needs when you did that?
So we do both. When I was working in one hospital, occupational therapy specialized in feeding. When I worked at another hospital, occupational therapy specialized in development. So it really differs all over the country where you are. But again, we're really broad. So you can get an order for a kid for feeding, and then you could get an order on another floor for a kid for helping them get back up and out of bed.
So my son was a prem, and he was born, and I didn't recognize his sensory issues until he was 5 years old, and his vestibular system was out of whack. So there's a lot of stuff that we parents do not know and do not understand. But when we're talking about food today and sensing with food and our sensory issues with that, do you find that children who are in hospital are more challenged with their sensory issues around food because of the experiences they go through in hospital? Or do you find that there are just a lot of kids that are challenged?
So I think it can go both ways. So yes, definitely hospital experiences can change the outcomes of eating, especially our premature babies. They come out, and one of the most common misconceptions is that we just innately know how to eat. And that's what we think. We think we're born and we know how to eat, but it's actually learned. Luckily, we have reflexes when we're born that help us. But when we have our premature babies, things are different. They're not in the belly for as long. They're thrown out into the world a little bit earlier. And so it actually changes that. So definitely our premature babies often have a harder time eating. Those kind of unpleasant hospital experiences, they learn from those. So just like us, if we get a shot over and over, we know a shot's not enjoyable. And, we start to learn that. So for maybe somebody who is having not so pleasurable eating experiences in the hospital because they feel nauseous or something doesn't feel good, or for our premature babies, a lot more times they are still learning. So maybe they cough or choke a little more often. They're learning that it's not as pleasurable. So I think that hospital experiences can definitely change eating. But on the other hand, when it comes to sensory preferences and sensory processing, we could also just be born with sensory differences. And so there's actually a study that was done, I think it's the University of Southern California, and they studied the brain. They actually scanned the brains. And you might have heard that people say people with sensory difficulties or neurodiversity that we're wired differently. Mm-hmm. And that's because they actually found that the white matter in the brain was different for somebody with sensory processing disorder.
Wow.
So part of it is also biological.
That's a great thing to hear, isn't it? Because it's great when science proves something. It's nice to have it sitting there going, well, this is how it really is, because it does change people's thoughts around that. Because I know that a lot of people think, and you talk about not liking the term picky eaters, because I know that a lot of people just think that they're just being annoying, really, just not eating what is put in front of them and what they're supposed to be given. So how do you, when people come to you, what do they usually come to you with problems around? What are they finding with their children that they need fixing?
I would say the biggest thing when it comes to feeding is the lack of variety. Is probably the one that I hear the most when they come in is they're only eating, I could count on my hand, 5 different foods. So I would say that's the big one. Of course, weight gain is another big one, but definitely that lack of variety and just the constant mealtime battles, the constant feeling of exhaustion on a parent's part and dread for mealtime. And those are the biggest ones.
And the fact that we've got society sitting there saying you need to feed your children nutritious food, you need to be, and then you watch some other child who's eating every single thing on their plate and then you're overwhelmed by the fact that somebody else has got it good and you haven't. So with the children that really only like basically 5 foods and that's all they're going to put into their bodies, how do you get them to create a wider food base? How do you get the parents to teach them about other foods?
Yeah, well, the first thing we usually do, if I'm doing a actual feeding evaluation or therapy, one-to-one therapy, the first thing is to figure out why they're having a difficulty. So there's a bunch of different reasons, whether it's sensory processing or it could be the way that your muscles in your mouth move. Uh-huh. It could be allergies. It could be GI related. So, of course, that first step is figuring out why. Now, of course, my favorite thing is sensory processing. So from a sensory perspective, my very first thing is I want them to feel comfortable at the table. So right now, when it comes to our senses, typically what's kind of happening scientifically is our senses. So we have our 8 senses, not 5. We have 8 senses and they are taking in everything every single moment, right? And it's sending a message to the brain. The brain interprets it and then it tells us how to respond. So when it comes to food, a lot of the time what's happening is, say we have a piece of broccoli. They're looking at that piece of broccoli. It's going to the brain. The brain is like, oh no. And it's sending the message back, do not do this, do not do this. So it's kind of interpreting it as threatening. So our senses' main purpose, above all else, our senses are here to protect us. They're here to see when there's a car coming and to move out of the way. They're here to feel the spider coming up our leg. Only once we feel safe can we move on to interacting in our world, to enjoying our life, to eating. So that first step for me is calming down the senses, making sure they feel safe. And then from there, working on skills.
What a great perspective, because we don't ever think about the fear around food or it saving ourselves. I mean, I know a lot of people want to save themselves from broccoli, but it is so how do you get them to, once, if they've got that obviously flight fear around the food that's being presented, how do you know from that, you work out what's happening, how do you know what foods then to give them or how to introduce it? What's your process after that?
Yeah, so one of the first things I'm doing when I'm working with a child or when I'm meeting somebody, or even one of the first things I teach my parents when they take my courses is you have to get to know their body. So every sensory system, every single one of us has unique preferences. So I kind of say it's like a fingerprint. So everybody's sensory system is very different. The first thing I want to know is how do they respond to what a food looks like? Is there certain foods that look different? Is there certain foods that they have a harder time with? How do they respond to the touch? How do they respond to the crunch in their mouth, to the smell? And so we're looking at all those different components, and I actually go through each and every sense to see, okay, they respond in this way to this sense. And from there, I'm going to introduce things that feel more comfortable to them. So say a child I'm going to say one of our favorite things is bread, because that is just a very common thing for everyone. So we're going to start with, okay, can we try a different kind of bread that looks similar, that looks the same, and work up from there?
Right. So very simple. Can I just give a quick example of an adult with a sensory thing like this? My husband saw mince in the fridge, all in layers, and he thought it looked like brains because it was all minced. And he said to me, do not give me that mince for dinner tonight because it looks like brains and I'm not going to eat it. So I thought, get over yourself. So I mashed it all up, put it in a sauce, put it in a lasagna. Didn't look like brains at all. And as he was eating it, he said to me, is this the meat that you had in the fridge? And I said, yes. And he said, I can't eat it. So he cannot eat mince now because it reminds him of brains, and he's an adult. So, when you're talking about this, as a child, I can really see that it's really, really important to see how the thread of the food is.
Yeah, immediately we're looking at his visual system interpreted that as threatening. It's brains. I don't want to eat brains. And it interprets that, and it sends a message to us like, I can't do this. And the interesting thing is that as an adult, he can say, I don't want to eat this. I'm not going to eat this. But with a child, they don't really have that same option, right? We're, as adults and as parents, we're telling them, no, you need to take a bite of that. You have to take a bite of that before you can get up. And with the sensory system, that often doesn't work very well. The senses don't like to be forced. So the fight or flight response kicks in. They either book it from the table,
yep,
or they're fighting and screaming at you, and you have those mealtime battles.
So where do we go to? So you've introduced your bread and you're changing the dimensions of possibly what that bread looks like, etc. So how, after bread, do you manage to get in some healthy food? Tell us about your food play and the other options that you have sitting there.
Yeah, so there's kind of two options here that I really use and I really like. And one is called food chaining, and that is the idea that we start from a food that somebody really likes, so again, our bread, and we continually make small changes to that. So one of the biggest misconceptions is that something like chips, cookies, candy, those aren't helpful. That those, if my child doesn't eat a variety, I just shouldn't offer that to them, and I shouldn't offer those. But if those are foods that a child is more comfortable with, there's a reason for that. And so we can actually build on those. So say we start with something like, I'm going to actually give an example for me, because growing up, I was not the most adventurous eater. I didn't really eat a lot of fruits or vegetables. And then I went to college, and all my friends were eating these power berries from Trader Joe's. I don't know if you guys have a Trader Joe's in Australia.
No, we don't. What is Trader Joe's?
It's a fun kind of grocery store here that has different things. They make their own unique stuff. So it's like a chocolate-covered berry. It has no fruits or anything in it. But it was the first time I had ever tried anything berry flavored. before that, the thought of eating a strawberry, a blueberry would have made me truly gag. And
Wow.
so, I had that and I was like, oh, this is pretty good. So then I went to the store and I was like, oh, maybe I'll try a blueberry waffle. Again, still didn't have a whole berry in it. From there, I was like, oh, maybe I'll try blueberry muffins. And then from there, I was like, oh, I'm going to try a blueberry. And so that's an example of how I started at candy and ended up at blueberries. And I think that's so much of what we miss sometimes is that we can start from one, and we call it food chaining, and we build and we continually make small changes until we end up at those more nutrient-dense foods that we are so hoping for.
And so in a way, it was the flavours almost that got you in. So you had a taste of the flavour and that developed and fortunately developed into a really healthy thing, which is a great food chain movement, that one. So that's very interesting, because I think most of us sitting here listening are thinking, well, normally none of those thoughts go through my head when I would have been trying to feed anyone, and I just looked at my husband when he had said this before I had seen your stuff, and I was like, that's ridiculous. You're a grown man. Surely just eat the meat. I can't believe it. But now I'm going to have a much better headset around it. I won't try and force it into him anymore. And also a lot of the time, what we're trying to get children to eat is what society is telling us is really important. I'm sure there are other ways that, like you say, we can get the goodness into them. So if they are starting to engage in eating more food, have you got any other techniques of introducing it? The way you're talking you just gave was great. What other techniques can we use to introduce fruit and veg?
Yes. So kind of as I said, there's two techniques I really like. That first one is food chaining. The other thing that I really like is something called the SOS approach to eating. And so this was created by Dr. Kay Toomey. She's a psychologist, but she has so much knowledge, both because she works with OTs, speech therapists, on the sensory system. And she's actually created an approach that I just think is fabulous for sensory processing because it doesn't force the sensory. What it does is it helps kids gradually take steps to become more comfortable with new foods. So again, the sensory system, it really does not enjoy being forced. So when we look at a child and we look at a baby who's learning to eat, they don't just all of a sudden start swallowing foods. That's not really what we do. We have them look at us eating, they're watching us, maybe they reach their hand out for it, then they start to play with it. You see it get in their head, their eyes, their nose. Then finally they get a taste. And then they start to learn, okay, I'm tasting, I'm eating, and then they start to swallow. And so that's actually a developmentally appropriate way to learn about food. And yet when it comes to us as adults and kids, we just try and chuck that out the window. But the other example I love giving for adults, because I think it's very relatable for most of us, is sushi. So think about that very first time you ever tried sushi or you ever saw sushi. Did you immediately try it that first time?
I didn't.
I definitely didn't. I took a couple times. I would watch my friends eat it. I was like, oh, it's kind of gross, right?
And it smells too. It's got a smell around the... Yes. Yep.
And so you're kind of watching other people. Then you're like, okay, you know what? Everybody seems to be loving sushi. Maybe I should give it a shot. And you put it on your plate. Maybe you poke it a couple times. And you're like, I don't know. Then the next time, maybe you touch it to your teeth and you try and try it out. And so again, we do this naturally as adults. Kids haven't learned this yet, but it's called the steps to eating. And so what we do is we help kids take small steps, starting with, and some people do have to start at this, being in the same room as a new food, to being able to interact, to look at it. First thing is look at it. So again, was your husband able to continue looking at that meat?
No.
So that first step is looking, then it's interacting with something like a utensil. Then it's smelling it. Can we tolerate the smell? Touching it with our hands. From touching it with our hands, we're going to work on touching it to things around our face, our mouth. Then tasting, then biting, and then chewing and swallowing. So we're helping them take those small steps. But as an OT, we are doing it in a fun way. So, and I think that's really key, is that our entire focus when it comes to as a feeding therapist and as an occupational therapist is kids learn through play. They don't learn the same way that we as adults learn of sitting down and just listening. They learn through experiencing and through enjoying. That's their main job in life, is to play. And so that's kind of what you were getting at, I think, before, is that food play. And so we do this in playful ways. So an example of it would be if I was going to introduce something like that broccoli, what I would start with is having them watch me make a forest with my broccoli. And then maybe I would start it with tweezers, but then I would use my fingers, and then I would knock it down with my fingers, and I would knock it down with my nose. And as you can see, we've already started to move up those steps. First, they were watching me. Now they're knocking it down with their nose, then knocking it down with their tongue. And then maybe we're putting it in our mouth and doing something fun, spitting it. And so taking those really fun, small steps that help them feel comfortable. It's not take a bite. It's, oh, look at my broccoli tree. Look at how my broccoli tree jumps across the table. It's just a little more playful and fun, and it relates to them in a way they can learn.
I really love that, because I think that you're right. I'm a school teacher, and play is one of the most important things, and a lot of play gets taken out of children's lives these days anyway. So all the learning that they do get through play is gone. And the thing about it is, it's more, as an adult, we like everything to be neat and tidy, don't we? And as soon as they get past that time where they throw all their food off their tray and you go, yes, at last I've got a child that's finally eating off a plate and not doing anything. So really, for the parent, you actually have to let go. Obviously, you just have to let go of a whole lot of societal things around food and allow them, and it does make sense, and allow them to play with it. I mean, hopefully not when you're out at a restaurant, but, in that sense, I totally understand, and I think that's a brilliant way of looking at it for the people listening. If you've got younger children in particular, obviously, I think that's a great way to go. Obviously, as you get older, it's probably harder with older eaters who might do, though, I suppose, would you do it with teenagers?
I do. So I see a lot of older children. Older children is definitely one of my specialties.
Mm-hmm.
And we play differently, but we still play. And I think actually one of the biggest misconceptions about food play is that my kids are going to go out, they're going to be throwing their food off the table, and it's going to be this mess. And one, we always set boundaries around this. So food always stays on the table. And maybe we explain it's okay to teach that at home we do this. When we go out and we're with people, we do this. It's okay to teach them that. And it's also okay to teach them how to explore when I'm in my sessions, I'm not throwing foods backwards on the floor. I'm keeping it within the confines of my plate. And I think the biggest misconception too, along with this, is that it's going to last forever. So our goal isn't to do food play forever. It's to get them to the place where they feel confident and curious about their food and want to explore. So, and I'm thinking about an older kid I'm working with now. We did start with food play because there was so much anxiety around food in general that even those older kids, sometimes they need to take away the pressure of being with that. And food play for them looks different. So food play for an older kid, I'm letting them cut the food. I'm letting them start to cook. I'm doing different kinds of play with them. But now we're at the point where I put a food down on the plate and they just pick it up and try it. So it's not the end-all be-all goal that we're going to have big food play every single day at dinner. It's to get them past that anxiety at the table so that they can develop excitement and curiosity around food.
And it gives them choice. And it also gives them skills. A lot of kids...
It gives them skills. Yes. So I think that so much of the time we believe that we need to get children to eat. It is our job to get nutrition into them. But is that really our only job here? Or is our job to teach them skills to be independent to eat as they grow? And that's more where I fall, is our job is to teach them skills so that they can happily and successfully eat.
That's a wonderful goal. That is a wonderful goal. So You help parents. So how do you help parents? Could you tell us about how they can get in contact with you if they'd like to? And because we're in Australia, if we've got people over here, how obviously you must Zoom or run courses online. So can you tell us how we can reach you?
Yes. So what I do now is I have online education courses for parents because I truly believe that knowledge is power. And the more we know about the mind and the body, the better you can support both yourself and your child at the table. And so my website, drsamgoldman.com is the best way to reach me. But I do also have a podcast, the Food Explorers podcast. And over there, I give just a ton of education, both on my website and there, all about how to support your child at the table. And I do it in really bite-sized ways. So my goal is always bite-sized information for parents because I know you are busy, you are exhausted, and you're tired, and you want to learn quickly.
And Sam's website and podcast is fabulous, and it is bite-sized, and the nuggets of information are gold. And having you on today is gold. Thank you so much for sharing that information, because there's so many sensory needs that need to be met out there. And this is a great way to start. Thank you, Sam.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Kate.
Let's get curious before we get frustrated about our kids' refusal to eat certain foods. Ask the questions: how does it look to them? What does it taste like? How does it feel? How does it sound? What does it smell like? Start understanding their sensory journey of food from their point of view. Ask yourself, do I find some foods that I find sensorily uncomfortable? I'm sure you'll be able to find a few. Wishing you happier mealtimes and more fun at the dinner table. Just don't throw your food. I'm Kate Mason. Thank you for listening to Parenting and Personalities. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could leave a rating and a review that would help others learn about this podcast. If you're interested in discovering more about you and your family's personality types, you'll find my book, Who Is This Monster or Treasure in My House, on Booktopia or Amazon. If you have an episode idea, please send a note to thepersonalitycoach@gmail.com. Many thanks to our producers at Stories and Strategies, and we'll see you next time.